the enemy of mankind. Our fortunate pirate robbed the world's richest man and nearly doomed the British Empire. In the late 17th century, an aspiring pirate fled with unprecedented riches and nearly sealed the fate of the British Empire. Hunted across the globe, he and his crew managed to evade capture with their ill-gotten gains. 300 years later, an American treasure hunter found the key to unraveling his mystery. Root tells the untold story of the famous pirate Henry Avery. James Bailey had dreamed his whole life of finding treasure. His first discovery was at the age of 4 when he found a bag of toy coins that his father had hidden for him. Over time, his childhood fascination with treasure hunting evolved into a hobby. Bailey worked as a prison guard in the American state of Rhode Island, but in his spare time, he combed the surrounding areas with a handheld metal detector. Typically, his finds only piqued the interest of history enthusiasts, but that didn't bother Bailey. He was one of them. Luck smiled upon him in 2014. Bailey decided to test his brand new metal detector in a garden near Newport. He had scouted this location many years ago, visited it multiple times, and found numerous intriguing items. He had come across buckles that had gone out of fashion 3 centuries ago, cannonballs, lead spoons, and ancient coins from the time when Rhode Island was an English colony. Newport was one of the largest cities in North America. The new metal little is known about Avery's youth. It is unclear if he was actually Avery. Many knew him as Benjamin Bridgman or by the nickname Long Ben. When the future pirate was barely 20 years old, he became a sailor in the Royal Navy. The ship he served on hunted Barbary pirates who attacked English villages, abducted residents, and sold them into slavery in Algiers or Morocco. In 1690, Avery retired and ventured into the slave trade himself. He worked for the governor of Bermuda, transporting black slaves from Africa, and was notorious for his cruelty. "I have never met such submissive Negroes as here," wrote Thomas Phillips, an agent of the Royal African Company. "I can imagine that they have already been introduced to the tricks that such blades as Long Ben, also known as Avery, are capable of." 3 years later, Avery joined the British privateer ship Charles Roman II, which was headed for the Caribbean in search of gold from sunken Spanish galleons. However, the expedition failed even before it began. Due to poor organization, the ship remained in England for several months, during which the crew was not paid. Eventually, the crew mutinied, seized the ship, and marooned the captain ashore. They elected Avery in his place, who claimed to know where they could make a real profit. Detector proved to be more sensitive and worked where the old one remained silent. Bailey started digging and found a tiny silver coin at a depth of 20 centimeters. When he rinsed it with water, an Arabic script became visible on the surface. Neither Bailey nor his numismatist friends had ever seen anything like it. He showed the discovery to an expert, but their conclusion only raised more questions. It turned out that the coin was minted in Yemen in 1693. But how did it end up in Newport? Since at that time, American colonies were prohibited from trading with Asia, it couldn't have been brought by an ordinary merchant. That left pirates who were not bound by such laws. Bailey began researching pirates who operated in the Indian Ocean in the late 17th century and almost immediately found an answer. In 1695, the legendary Henry Avery plundered the ships of the Indian Emperor and soon disappeared without a trace. What if the strange coin with Arabic script is part of his treasure, which had remained hidden for 300 years? Henry Avery in 1659, when Henry Avery was born, Britain had not yet built its famous empire on which the sun never sets. Its American possessions were limited to a handful of colonies on the Atlantic coast, and there was no talk of conquering India. It may seem strange now, but at that time, India surpassed Europeans in almost every aspect from wealth to technology. History could have taken a very different path, and it almost did thanks to Avery. Thomas II in 1692. Captain Thomas II from the town of Newport set sail on a voyage that would make him the most famous pirate of his time. On his sloop, the Amity, he crossed the Atlantic Ocean, circumvented Africa, and attacked an Indian ship headed for the Red Sea. The loot exceeded his wildest expectations. The gold and silver carried by Indian merchants alone were worth no less than 100,000 pounds sterling. When they divided the plunder, each member of the Amity crew received between $2,000 to £3,000. For that time, it was an enormous sum, several times more than regular sailors earned in their entire lives. Two's share was even greater, £8,000. Such wealth would have been enough for him to retire and live a life of luxury. Avery was well aware of this story, and perhaps to himself. Both worked for the governor of the Bermuda Islands, but one was a slave trader, and and the other a privateer. Avery recounted Two's exploits to the crew of the Charles Roman II and suggested they could similarly enrich themselves with Indian gold. They readily agreed, but before they could embark on their adventure, they had to transform their captured ship. Avery ordered the removal of all unnecessary superstructures, including the luxurious captain's cabin. He saw nothing wrong with sleeping in the hold with the common sailors, but it made the ship much lighter and faster than before. The transformed Charles Roman II was given a new name, the Fancy. By August 1695, the newly minted pirates had circumvented Africa and anchored in a narrow strait between the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. It was the perfect place for an ambush. There was no other way from the Red Sea to India, and the opposite shores were just 24 kilometers apart. To cross the strait, Indian ships would inevitably have to pass by the Fancy. As it turned out, the idea had occurred to others as well. Soon, the bark Portsmouth Adventure and the brigantine Dolphin, captained by a former lieutenant of Thomas II, arrived in the strait. Then, without any prior coordination, 3 more ships joined them: the bark Susanna, the brigantine Pearl, and finally, Thomas II on his Amity. Under Avery's leadership, a true fleet was formed: 6 ships and over 400 pirates. But it was all in vain. After nearly a month of waiting, Avery and his men managed to miss the Indian fleet returning from the Yemeni city of Mocha. On the 27th of August, more than 20 ships, including the massive imperial flagship Ganjai Sawai, slipped through the strait under the cover of night. The pirates realized what had happened only in the morning. By that time, the missed ships had disappeared beyond the horizon, and Avery refused to admit defeat and, after negotiations with other captains, set off in pursuit. The Fancy sailed at full speed, towing the slow-moving Pearl behind it, while the Portsmouth Adventure lagged behind with difficulty. The Amity and Susanna trailed further behind. They decided to sacrifice the Dolphin, a barely floating brigantine, and its crew was taken aboard Avery's ship. The Amity quickly fell behind the Fancy, but Thomas II decided to continue the chase alone. It was he who managed to catch up with the Indian ship first. He encountered a slower trading vessel called the Fateh Mohammed, owned by the wealthy Indian merchant Abdul Ghaffar. The Indians greeted the Amity with a barrage of cannon fire. One of the cannonballs hit two, and he fell with a terrible wound on his abdomen. A few minutes later, the most famous pirate of his time died on the deck of the defeated ship, clutching his own entrails. The Mogul fleet Avery was unaware of Two's death or the fact that the ships he was pursuing were not ordinary merchants. The expedition was organized by none other than Aurangzeb, the emperor of the Mughal Empire, which controlled almost all of India, as well as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan. At that time, he was one of the most influential rulers and undoubtedly the richest person in the world. The flagship of the Indian fleet, the magnificent Ganjai Sawai, could accommodate over 1,000 people and surpassed almost any European ship in size, not to mention the Fancy and its companions, which could barely fit a few dozen sailors. Despite its peaceful purpose, the Ganjai Sawai was not defenseless. It had 80 cannons and over 400 soldiers armed with muskets to protect its cargo, crew, and passengers. The purpose of the voyage was not only trade, although that was certainly part of it. The ships carried devout Muslims returning to India after their pilgrimage to Mecca. The most notable passengers sailed on the Ganjai Sawai, and among them were dozens of women, primarily from the nobility and even relatives of the emperor, including his granddaughter. On the 10th day of the chase, the lookout on the Fancy spotted land on the horizon Cape St. John near Bombay. Soon, the ships came into view. After overtaking the Amity, the Fateh Mohammed caught up with several smaller vessels and headed full sail for Surat, the most important port on the west coast of India, which was only a short distance away. Avery ordered his crew to raise the sails, bypass the Fateh Mohammed, and sail directly toward it. After a brief skirmish, the battered Indian ship surrendered without causing any harm to the Fancy and its crew. On board, Avery's men found gold and silver worth 60,000 pounds sterling, approximately $5 million modern dollars or 365 million rubles. 3 days later, the lookout spotted another Indian ship. The flagship of the emperor, the massive Ganjai Sawai, was approaching Surat. Under normal circumstances, the Fancy had no chance of defeating such an opponent. But on that day, luck was on Avery's side. Even before the battle on the Ganjai Sawai began, one of the cannons exploded. Several people died instantly, and even more were seriously wounded. Then came the first salvo from the Fancy. The cannonballs hit the mainmast of the Indian ship, causing it to collapse, taking all the rigging with it. It was almost an incredible stroke of luck. Pirates took advantage of the chaos and went for the boarding. The fancy crew achieved victory without losses, while 25 people were killed on the Indian side. The pirates themselves were probably amazed at how easily they managed to capture the mighty Ganj Sawai. Indians blamed the defeat on the captain's cowardice. Indian historian Hafi Khan, who later spoke with surviving passengers, claimed that he simply fled. As soon as the Englishmen boarded, Captain Ibrahim Khan hid in a hold. There he had Turkish concubines he had bought in Mocha. He put turbans on them, gave them swords, and sent them to fight. They immediately fell into the hands of the enemy, who soon became the full masters of the ship. The cargo of the Indian ship was astonishing in its wealth. In addition to spices, ivory, porcelain, and other goods, the pirates found an unprecedented amount of gold, silver, and gemstones. British sources claim that Avery had seized valuables worth £600,000 equivalent to approximately $60 million today or 4.4 billion rubles. Hafi Khan wrote that the Englishmen had taken 5.2 million rupees, gold, and Spanish reals from the Ganj Sawai. According to other estimates, the loot was smaller but still very significant, around £200,000. The East India Company on September 12th, the plundered Fath Mohammadi arrived in Surat, and India learned of the pirate attack. The ship's owner immediately accused the British East India Company of being responsible. A furious crowd gathered outside the company's factory in Surat, demanding retribution against the English. Formerly, the East India Company was a commercial enterprise and one of the world's earliest joint stock companies. However, in practice, it had more in common with states than regular corporations. It had its own armies and fleet, waged wars, and suppressed uprisings. Over time, it would turn India into a British colony, with its managers becoming colonial governors. But at that time, this had not yet happened. The East India Company had only a few trading posts in India, and its influence in the country was extremely limited. To stay on good terms with the mayor of Surat, the company's representatives had to pay huge bribes. This is what saved them, not wanting to lose profitable partners. The mayor sided with the English and sent soldiers to protect the factory. The mayor believed that by the time news of the attack on the Fath Mohammadi reached the court of the Mughal emperor in Delhi, the passions would have subsided, and things would return to normal. The company's managers and employees hoped for an even better outcome for them. It was a matter of life and death. 5 days later, the Ganj Sawai arrived in Surat with the remnants of its crew and passengers. The survivors recounted that after capturing the ship, the pirates had tormented their prisoners for a whole week and violated female pilgrims. The inhuman treatment and ruthless torture inflicted on the poor Indians and their women still haunt my soul, admitted one of Avery's crew members later. When the Ganj Sawai came under their control entirely, the pirates transferred all the gold and silver to their own ship and took so many people as captives that it became overcrowded. They then brought the Mughal emperor's flagship to the shore near one of their settlements. For a week, they searched for loot, stripped men of their dignity, and subjected old and young women to abuse before abandoning the ship and its passengers to their fate. Some women took advantage of this and threw themselves into the sea to escape dishonor. Others took their own lives with knives or daggers. Hafi Khan, upon learning of the fate of the Ganj Sawai, the mayor of Surat ordered the arrest of all the Englishmen in the city and put the local managers of the East India Company in shackles. The emperor might have forgiven the Fath Mohammadi after all. Profit was more important than one ship. But after what happened on the Ganj Sawai, it was clear that there would be no forgiveness. News of the pirate attack reached Delhi several weeks later. The emperor considered the treatment of the pilgrims sacrilegious and agreed with the owner of the Fath Mohammadi that the East India Company was behind the attack. He ordered the closure of all English factories in India, the imprisonment of their managers, and preparations for the siege of the Bombay fortress, the Indian headquarters of the company, where its president, John Jaya, had taken refuge. Jaya's first dispatch with the account of the pirate crisis reached London only in December, followed by 3 more. In his messages, he confirmed that the pirates had dealt barbarically with the people on the Ganj Sawai and Abdul Gaffar's ship. According to him, due to the emperor's anger, many employees were facing death, and the company itself was facing complete expulsion from the peninsula, marking the end of English trade with India and Britain's colonial ambitions. To appease the Mughal emperor, Avery needed to be captured, wrote Jaya. The company immediately ordered its representatives in India to detain all passing ships for questioning, but this proved insufficient. After several weeks, The company's leadership secured the support of the Lord Justices, who ordered the British military fleet and colonial authorities to join the hunt for the pirates. To gain the attention of the king, it took several more months. In August 1696, nearly a year after the attack on the Ganj Sawai, William Roman III announced a reward for the capture of Avery or any member of his crew. The royal decree strongly hinted that the British authorities were counting on the assistance of other pirates. If they were to hand over Avery themselves, they could expect both a reward and clemency. The flight of the Fancy Avery understood that he would be pursued. After dividing the loot, the Fancy set sail for Reunion, a French island off the eastern coast of Africa, known as a pirate haven. In the port, he identified himself as Benjamin Bridgman, claimed to be involved in smuggling slaves, and as proof, he purchased 90 enslaved black individuals captured on the nearby island of Madagascar. The French did not suspect anything, which is not surprising. It is entirely possible that the Fancy reached Reunion faster than any other ships that could have brought news of the plundering of the Ganj Sawai. Avery proposed sailing to the Bahamas, where there was a small British colony at the time, and they'd dispose of the ship. If they traveled there directly without stopping at ports controlled by Europeans, the chances of capture would be minimal. First, because no one would know where the pirates were. Second, this was the only way the Fancy could outpace ships carrying news and orders from London to the Bahamas. Not everyone agreed, but in the end, Avery's plan prevailed. The Fancy left Reunion, circumvented Africa, and set a course westward. Midway to South America, the pirates stopped at the uninhabited Ascension Island. There, they caught sea turtles, which served as their food for the remainder of the journey. 17 individuals, fearing that Avery was leading them straight to the English gallows, refused to continue and remained on the island. The Fancy reached the Bahamas at the end of April 1696. By that time, London had received Gyre's letters, and the East India Company had begun its own search for the pirates. However, the king had not yet declared Avery an outlaw. The pirates couldn't have known this, but were prepared for the worst. Avery chose to act cautiously and didn't immediately disembark on the shore. Instead, he sent a letter to the governor of the Bahamas, requesting permission to come ashore and then depart freely. For this, the governor could potentially gain control of the Fancy and a bribe comparable in size to his 3-year salary. It's challenging to imagine a more suspicious proposition. A person who, without any apparent reason, promises wealth solely for the opportunity to come ashore is undoubtedly hiding something. The governor couldn't help but suspect he was dealing with a pirate. Nevertheless, he ultimately responded with agreement. After all, what was the harm in harboring a pirate? America had plenty of them, and they hadn't heard of the Ganj Sawai in the Bahamas. What they were lacking, though, was a well-armed ship, and the Fancy came in very handy. On the Bahamas, Avery's crew split up. A few individuals acquired a new sloop and, despite the risk, returned to Britain. Most decided to seek refuge in the American colonies. Avery himself and another 20 crew members left the island on a single-masted sailboat named the Sea Flower. In late June, the Sea Flower docked in the Irish town of Dingle. Several weeks later, the king declared Avery hostis humani generis, an enemy of all mankind, and promised a generous reward for his head. By the end of the summer, in various parts of England, they had captured and hanged 6 sailors from the Fancy who had been recklessly spending money. But Avery himself and 72 other individuals disappeared without a trace, along with their ill-gotten gains. To reconcile with the Padishah Emperor of India, the East India Company had to pay substantial reparations. However, it survived, and very soon the Indians would regret it. The Newport expedition Rhode Island treasure hunter James Bailey first became interested in Avery's story when he found an ancient Yemeni coin in Newport. Several years later, enthusiasts and archaeologists discovered 16 more similar coins in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. All the coins that could be dated were minted before 1695, which was before the attack on the Ganj Sawai. Many of them were remarkably well preserved, as if they had hardly been used. Bailey was almost certain that these were remnants of the plundered Indian treasures. In search of confirmation for his theory, he combed through local archives and unearthed new facts about Avery's route that had gone unnoticed by anyone before him. Bailey found out that before departing for Ireland, the ship Sea Flower, on which Avery sailed from the Bahamas, had stopped in Newport. According to documents, it brought 48 enslaved Africans to Rhode Island, which was a huge rarity for the region. In the late 17th century, most enslaved people who arrived in this colony came from the Caribbean islands. 14 of the enslaved individuals were immediately sold, while the rest was sent to Boston. They had to travel on foot because the ship had already left. According to Bailey's theory, this indicates that Avery visited Newport before sailing across the Atlantic. Everything fits: the African slaves, whom the pirate bought in Reunion, the inexplicable haste, even the dates. The likely reason for this risky expedition was probably not money. Sea flour was barely profitable. Bailey suggests that Avery might have needed the enslaved people only for a more convincing disguise as a slave trader. However, his true intentions remain a mystery for now. Only some information is available about the pirates who stayed in America. In 1698, authorities in Rhode Island captured William Downes, who had sailed with Avery even before the mutiny on the Charles Roman II. But he easily escaped from prison, moved to a neighboring town, and got married. Captain William Mays Jr. continued piracy in the Red Sea for another 2 years, then returned to his hometown Newport and inherited his father's tavern, the White Horse, which surprisingly still operates to this day, with an average Yelp rating of 4 stars.